Welcome, everyone. Before we unpack today's massive, truly explosive topic,
Right.
make sure to like and subscribe to the show.
Absolutely.
You know exactly how much it helps us bring you these incredibly detailed, long-form explorations. So let's jump right into today's mission. We are reviewing a highly provocative, deeply detailed new ebook.
Very detailed.
Yeah, it's called Walk Off the Plantation, Escape Feminist Economics as a Man, written by Conrad Reicher. And look, we've specifically curated this deep dive for you, the listener who closely follows men's rights activism, the manosphere, and what's broadly known as the red pill community.
Right.
You're someone who is intensely curious about the historical shifts in our modern institutions. You want to understand the mechanics of how, according to this book at least, these institutions were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Way before the general public even realized a shift was happening.
Exactly. Long before. And let me tell you right out of the gate, this book is an ultra-long, incisive, and honestly fascinating manual that it completely deconstructs modern society from the absolute ground up.
It really does.
If you want to read the full manual yourself, and I guarantee after this deep dive, you are going to want to dig into his sources, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now. And be sure to follow the author, at Conrad Reicher, at his Substack. It is a dense, heavily researched text, and we're going to break it all down for you today.
But before we dive into the raw data, the case law, and the deep historical analysis Riker provides, we absolutely need to establish the ground rules for today's discussion.
Yeah, super important.
The source material we are reviewing today contains highly politically charged content. It touches on very sensitive left-wing and right-wing themes. So we must state explicitly, right here at the top, that we never take sides on this show.
Never.
We are impartially reporting on the content provided to convey the ideas contained in the original source material. We are not endorsing Reicher's viewpoints, nor are we condemning them. Our role today is strictly as objective guides. We are here to unpack his data, interrogate his arguments, and map out his overarching worldview so you, the listener, can understand the architecture of his claims and make up your own mind.
That is an absolutely critical point. We are simply looking at the blueprint Reicher has laid out on the table. So let's unpack this blueprint. The foundational thesis of this book, the lens through which Reicher views almost everything else, is what he calls the plantation economy.
And the corporate takeover of marriage.
Right. He makes this sweeping argument that modern men are no longer treated as equal partners in a marriage, but rather as what he terms financial serfs. He argues that the institution of marriage has been legally transformed into a hostile corporate takeover. And to illustrate this, he doesn't just use theory.
No, not at all.
He brings up some truly harrowing real-world anecdotes.
He does, and the way he uses these anecdotes is very deliberate. He wants to ground the legal theory in visceral reality. For instance, he details the case of a man named Bill Gallagher.
Oh man, this case.
Yeah. Bill is an IT engineer from Ohio making about $140,000 a year. By all traditional societal metrics, Bill is a massive success. He did everything he was supposed to do. But his wife filed for divorce. And Reicher emphasizes that there was no infidelity on Bill's part.
None.
No abuse, no hidden gambling debt, just a text message from his wife saying, "I'm done."
And the financial fallout for this guy is just breathtaking. According to the book, Bill now pays $4,200 every single month in combined child support and alimony.
Wow.
Keep in mind, he has equal 50-50 custody of his kids and zero misconduct on his record. Yet, he's working his full-time engineering job plus 2 side gigs, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, driving a 2008 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, and hasn't taken vacation in over half a decade.
It's brutal.
Reicher uses Bill to paint this very bleak picture of the modern American man. Highly productive, incredibly responsible, and yet, in Reicher's exact words, legally enslaved.
What's fascinating here is how Reicher connects Bill Gallagher's personal tragedy to a much broader legal and historical framework. He doesn't view Bill as an anomaly.
Right.
He views him as the intended output of the system. Reicher traces the root of this back to California's 1969 no-fault divorce law, which was signed by Ronald Reagan. Now, traditionally, if you look at mainstream history, no-fault divorce is framed as a massive liberation movement.
Right, that's the narrative we all learn.
Yeah, it was designed to allow people, particularly women, to escape toxic, dead-end, or physically abusive marriages without having to go to court and legally prove fault or endure a public trial.
It was about safety and freedom. But Reicher completely flips that narrative on its head, doesn't he?
Entirely. He frames no-fault divorce as the legal equivalent of handing a woman a corporate buyout option on her husband's life and future earnings. Suddenly, he argues, marriage shifted from a binding, lifelong commitment into a temporary arrangement that could be dissolved at will.
While still guaranteeing a payout.
Exactly. Riker backs this up with 2022 U.S. Census Bureau data showing that roughly 70% of all divorces are initiated by women. Furthermore, he points out that men receive alimony in only 2% of the cases where it's actually awarded.
2%.
To Riker, this massive statistical asymmetry isn't a sign that the system is broken or that men are simply worse partners. It's a sign that the system is working exactly as it was designed to work. The underlying business model of family court, he suggests, is to maximize revenue extraction from the most reliable payer in the dynamic,
The husband.
the husband.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. If a woman initiates 70% of divorces, a skeptic listening to this might just say, well, maybe men are just dropping the ball. Maybe they aren't pulling their weight at home and women are just fed up. How does Riker address that counter-argument? Does he just ignore it?
He addresses it directly by bringing in cases of extreme, undeniable male overperformance. To show that behavior actually doesn't protect the man, he introduces the case of Daniel Reeves, a software engineer in Austin pulling down $310,000 a year.
A huge earner.
According to Riker's documentation, Daniel was the quintessential model provider. He was up at 5:30 a.m., he coached the weekend soccer teams, he planned and funded the family vacations, he was doing everything the culture asked of him. Yet his wife filed for divorce, citing emotional disconnect,
Was it
a completely subjective metric.
Right.
And the result of that subjective disconnect, the court awarded her 70% custody of the children, $7,200 a month in child support, and an additional $4,500 in spousal support. Within 3 years of the judgment, Daniel had to declare bankruptcy.
So his point is that the harder Daniel worked to provide, the heavier the legal penalty became when the contract was broken.
Exactly. Riker uses this case to completely dismantle the idea of alimony reform, which is a big talking point in legal circles right now. He mentions a heavily publicized 2023 Florida law that supposedly limited the duration of alimony so men wouldn't be paying it until they died.
Oh.
But Riker points out that family court judges still have massive discretionary power. They use highly subjective, elastic terms like financial need and maintaining the marital standard of living to justify lifelong, crippling payments.
Wow.
To Riker, tweaking the alimony laws is just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. The fundamental architecture of the system, he argues, is explicitly built to transfer male wealth to women, regardless of the man's behavior during marriage.
And he actually points to the architects of this legal theory, right? He doesn't just say this is a shadow conspiracy. He says this is openly documented policy.
Yes, and this is where he leans heavily on the work of prominent feminist legal scholars, specifically Martha Feynman. He quotes extensively from her 1995 book, The Neutered Mother, The Sexual Family, and Other 20th Century Tragedies. Feynman explicitly argued that family law should be restructured to force men to be financially responsible regardless of relationship status.
Just stated right there in the text.
Riker presents this to the reader to say, look, this isn't a secret. The architects of modern family law proudly stated their intentions. He argues that feminist legal theory purposely designed a system where male sacrifice, male labor, and male provision aren't considered contributions to be valued, but rather liabilities to be leveraged.
Yeah, and it's not just the family courts. He takes aim at the IRS too. He points out what he calls the tax code's marriage penalty. I had to read this section twice because the numbers are so stark. He shows that a single man earning $100,000 pays roughly $18,000 in federal taxes. But if that same man marries a stay-at-home wife, his tax burden jumps to $22,500.
A huge jump.
Riker views this as a deliberate, state-sanctioned disincentive. It's a tax that specifically punishes the traditional male breadwinner role. The government, in his view, treats men as public infrastructure, literally a pipeline running straight from their paycheck to the state apparatus and to their ex-wives.
Which perfectly sets up his exploration of how this extraction engine actually functions on a bureaucratic level. If Riker believes marriage is the corporate buyout, he views family court as the collection agency. He asserts that the system systematically prioritizes maternal custody while reducing fathers to, quote, ATMs with a heartbeat.
ATMs with a heartbeat.
And the financial data he pulls to support this is staggering. For example, he cites that in 2019, the state of Illinois alone seized $1.3 billion in child support payments. But here's the kicker. The state kept $85 million of that money in what they categorize as administrative fees.
Wait, pause right there. Explain that to me like I'm 5. The state collects the child support from the father, but before giving it to the mother and children, they take an $85 million cut.
Precisely. Riker equates this to state-sponsored bureaucratic theft. He points out the absolute hypocrisy that men are routinely jailed for failing to pay these massive sums, losing their freedom, while the state essentially skims off the top like a mafia protection racket.
And why are the states so incredibly aggressive about this? Because anyone who has dealt with the child support system knows it is relentless.
Riker explains the mechanics behind this aggression by pointing to a specific piece of federal legislation, Title 5EG of the Social Security Act of 1975. This act created the modern federal child support enforcement program. The critical hidden insight Riker offers here is that states receive federal matching funds based directly on the amount of child support they successfully collect.
So is it
It creates a massive, perverse financial incentive. The more money a state extracts from non-custodial parents who are overwhelmingly fathers, the more federal funding that states' bureaucratic agencies receive from Washington.
So that's a bounty system.
That is exactly how Riker frames it. He argues this turns family courts into profit-driven collection agencies. In his view, the off-sided legal standard of the best interests of the child is nothing more than a convenient legal fiction. It's a smokescreen used to justify separating fathers from their children in order to trigger the child support mechanism and secure federal funding.
Unbelievable.
Furthermore, he highlights the 1986 Bradley Amendment. This is a crucial piece of law that prevents child support debt from ever being retroactively reduced or cleared in bankruptcy. You can lose your job in a recession, you can lose your home, you can get cancer and lose your health, but the state will never, ever forgive that debt. It accrues interest perpetually.
The case studies he uses in this section to illustrate the rigidity of this system are genuinely the stuff of nightmares. He talks about a man in Texas in 2022 who was ordered to pay $12,000 a month in child support for children that DNA tests categorically, scientifically proved were not biologically his.
Yeah.
His wife had an affair. But the court ruled he had to pay anyway because he, quote, held them out as his own during the marriage before he knew about the infidelity. Under the law, he is on the hook forever for another man's children.
And if you think that's extreme, he also details the story of Marcus Bell. This reads like a legal thriller. Bell had a casual one-night stand. They went to a restaurant. He wiped his mouth and left a napkin on the table. The woman retrieved the napkin, extracted his DNA, utilized a sketchy fertility clinic to get pregnant via IVF without his consent, and then sued him for child support.
And won.
And the court actually ruled in her favor to the tune of a $2.1 million lifetime child support obligation because biologically he was the father, regardless of the method of conception.
It's just unbelievable. And then there's David Kim in Massachusetts, who paid $5,100 a month for 12 straight years, totaling over $734,000 to an ex-wife who had already remarried, bought a second vacation home, and was actively earning $185,000 a year as a corporate lawyer.
Right.
The sheer shock value of these anecdotes isn't just for entertainment. Riker is using them to violently shake the reader awake to what he calls a gynocentric legal architecture. A system where the law bends over backward to protect female interests while treating male resources as an open buffet.
Which naturally raises a huge question about how the legal system processes allegations and disputes during the initial divorce filings. Because to get to the point of extraction, you first have to separate the father from the home. Riker dives incredibly deeply into the weaponization of false allegations. He cites a startling statistic from the American Psychological Association noting that up to 30% of all custody cases involve false or unsubstantiated claims of abuse.
30%. That is a massive margin of error for a legal system destroying families.
It is. But Riker explains why it happens so frequently. He points to the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, which created what are known as rebuttable presumptions against men. In plain English, this means if a mother makes an allegation of abuse, any allegation, the father is immediately presumed a danger and isolated from his children until he can legally prove his innocence.
Guilty until proven innocent.
Riker argues that in the tactical game of divorce, it fundamentally doesn't matter if the claim is completely fabricated or eventually disproven months later in court. The strategic damage is already done. The father's reputation in the community is ruined, his legal bills skyrocket into the tens of thousands just trying to see his kids, and during that separation period, the mother establishes a new status quo of primary custody.
He also points out something terrifying about the recent expansion of the Violence Against Women Act. It now includes incredibly vague terminology, like emotional abuse or coercive control. Riker argues that these terms are so hopelessly subjective they can be weaponized against a man simply for using a firm tone of voice during a standard marital argument, or for managing the family budget tightly. In Riker's analysis, the family courts are no longer interested in protecting families or finding the truth. Their primary function is to protect a predefined narrative of female victimhood and male menace.
And this is where Riker broadens his scope. He moves from the microcosm of the family court into the macrocosm of the entire Western economy. He takes dead aim at one of the most sacred cows of modern progressive economics, the gender pay gap. Specifically, the widely repeated statistic that women make 82 cents for every dollar a man makes. Riker absolutely dismantles this using granular statistical analysis.
I loved this section because it's something you hear quoted constantly in the media, by politicians, in HR seminars. It's presented as an indisputable law of physics. But when Riker actually unpacks the math, the narrative completely falls apart.
It completely vanishes. Riker points out that the so-called wage gap is just an aggregate average of all full-time working men versus all full-time working women. It doesn't account for choices. When economists actually control for variables like hours worked per week, the specific occupational field, the level of physical hazard, and continuous years in the workforce without parental leave, the gap shrinks to essentially zero. In some demographics, it actually inverts in favor of women.
And the hazard data he brings up is just brutal to read. He forces the reader to look at the jobs that actually keep civilization running. Men make up 94% of miners, 90% of construction workers, 88% of long-haul truck drivers, and most tellingly, men account for 93% of all workplace fatalities. Riker's core argument here is that men aren't paid more because of some invisible patriarchal privilege. They are paid more because they're willing to take on massive physical risk. They work longer, ungodly hours, and they absorb extreme physical tolls in freezing, dangerous, isolated environments that women, on average, simply choose not to enter.
Exactly. He backs this up with recent, highly credible data from institutions that certainly aren't considered right-wing. He cites a 2023 MIT study on salary negotiation. The researchers set up a scenario where men and women applied for identical jobs with identical resumes and qualifications. The study found that men were significantly more likely to aggressively negotiate for higher base pay, to request overtime eligibility, and to demand hazard bonuses.
So it's behavioral.
Riker argues this isn't evidence of systemic misogyny, it's simply a reflection of male agency and basic math. Men negotiate harder because societal pressure mandates that their value is intrinsically tied to their provision.
He also brings up that infamous 2021 internal pay equity report from Google.
Yes, that was a massive backfire for Google. They conducted this internal audit expecting to find that they were underpaying their female engineers, which would allow them to virtue signal by fixing it. But the algorithm revealed the exact opposite. Female software engineers at Google were actually earning 105% of what their male peers earned in the exact same roles with the same experience.
Backfired spectacularly.
Riker notes how quickly the mainstream media and feminist advocacy groups buried or openly mocked this report because it fundamentally contradicted their established victimhood narrative. He argues that an entire multi-billion-dollar grievance industry comprising HR departments, DEI consultants, and legal advocates depends on the 82-cent myth to justify their salaries and their expansion.
And he shows how this ideology has actually been codified into law internationally. We always hear about the Scandinavian countries as this progressive utopia. But Riker looks at Sweden's gender budgeting scheme, which has been active since 2007. This policy actively directs over 60% of all public social spending specifically to women, despite the fact that workforce participation between men and women in Sweden is nearly equal. Riker argues this is achieved by legally redefining the word equity to literally mean female priority.
He also looks at Norway's 2003 father quota. On the surface, forcing men to take mandatory paternity leave sounds like a pro-family policy. But Riker digs into the punitive mechanics of it. He points out that if the Norwegian father refuses to take the leave, perhaps because he owns a small business that would fail if he steps away, the state actually docks the family's total financial benefit package.
That's coercion.
Riker views this not as a progressive encouragement of fatherhood, but as raw state coercion designed to forcibly re-engineer traditional gender roles against the will of the citizens.
The starkest contrast he paints, though, is right back here in the U.S. regarding federal funding. You read this and it really makes your blood boil. He juxtaposes the $1.6 billion in annual federal funding given to the Violence Against Women Act with the complete lack of federal resources allocated for male victims of domestic violence.
And this is a massive blind spot in our culture. Riker cites Centers for Disease Control data again, the highest level of institutional data, indicating that men make up a full 40% of all domestic violence victims in the United States. Yet, there are virtually zero federally funded shelters for men. He shares horrific anecdotes of men showing up to hospital emergency rooms with severe lacerations or burns inflicted by their wives, only to be mocked by the triage nurses, treated with suspicion by the police, or literally told to reflect on what they did to provoke her.
Unbelievable.
To Riker, this is the smoking gun. It proves that state-sponsored feminist policies do not seek equality, they seek supremacy. They are willing to fund female victimhood endlessly while completely erasing and mocking male suffering.
Which begs the question, how did we get here? How did our institutions, from the courts to the hospitals to the HR department, become so uniformly aligned against men? This brings us to a section I know you listening are incredibly interested in, the historical capture of institutions. Riker argues that the anti-male bias we see today wasn't some organic cultural accident, it was meticulously engineered over a century. And he traces it all the way back to the Frankfurt School in Germany in 1923.
This is where Riker's deep historical research really shines. For those who aren't familiar, the Frankfurt School was a group of Marxist intellectuals associated with the Institute for Social Research at Goethe University in Frankfurt. Riker names key figures like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and especially Herbert Marcuse. He argues that when traditional economic Marxism failed to spark worker revolutions in the West because capitalism was making the working class too prosperous, these intellectuals shifted their strategy. They pivoted from economic warfare to cultural warfare. Their stated goal, according to Riker's analysis, was to dismantle Western civilization from within, and the primary obstacle in their way was the traditional nuclear family and the concept of patriarchal male authority.
And he zeroes in on Herbert Marcuse in a way that is just chillingly relevant to what we see in corporate America today.
Absolutely. Riker dedicates a massive portion of this chapter to dissecting Marcuse's highly influential 1965 essay titled Repressive Tolerance. Now, Riker translates the actual function of this essay as liberating tolerance. Marcuse openly argued that in order to achieve true liberation, society must redefine tolerance. It must strictly protect left-wing, revolutionary, progressive ideas while actively, ruthlessly suppressing conservative, traditional, or right-wing viewpoints.
So tolerance doesn't mean live and let live anymore. It means my side gets to speak, and your side gets silenced for the greater good.
Precisely. And Riker explicitly calls Marcuse's essay the literal operating manual for modern diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies and corporate human resources departments. He gives the example of the famous James Damore case at Google.
I don't know.
Damore was the engineer who wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology to explain why there might be fewer women in high-stress coding jobs. He wasn't being hateful, he was citing science. But Google fired him instantly. Riker argues this wasn't a PR move, this was Marcuse's philosophy in action. It is the deliberate suppression of objective, empirical reality in order to enforce strict ideological conformity. Under this framework, male competence is redefined as oppression, and traditional male strength is pathologized as toxic dominance.
And nowhere is this pathologizing of male behavior more evident, according to Riker, than in the modern public education system. He talks extensively about what he calls the boy crisis. He shares a story that, as a parent, just breaks your heart. He talks about a 10-year-old boy in a Massachusetts public school. The kid is frustrated during a difficult math test, he gets overwhelmed, and he throws his pencil across the room. Now, 30 years ago, the teacher would say, go pick up your pencil, calm down, and finish your test. Or maybe he gets a detention.
Sure.
Instead, the school immediately called a dedicated crisis intervention team, suspended the 10-year-old for 3 days, and mandated that the parents subject him to a psychiatric evaluation for latent aggressive tendencies before he could return to class.
Riker uses this to argue that schools today actively pathologize normal, rambunctious boyhood. The education system doesn't want builders, risk takers, or adventurers. It wants quiet, compliant, medicated students who sit still for 8 hours a day. And the curriculum reflects this ideological shift as well. To quantify this, Riker cites a brilliant 2021 study by the American Enterprise Institute. Researchers analyzed 12 of the most widely used major U.S. history textbooks in public high schools. They found that Susan B. Anthony was mentioned 12 times more often than George Washington.
That is just wild. The father of the country is eclipsed by an activist.
Right. And Riker uses this data point to argue that boys are systematically being taught that their historical heritage, their male lineage, is strictly one of oppression and tyranny, rather than a legacy of liberty, invention, and nation building. The psychological toll this takes is measurable. He points to a highly disturbing 2023 study published in the journal Psychological Science. The researchers demonstrated that when young boys are explicitly taught in a classroom setting that they belong to an oppressor class based entirely on their gender and race, their academic motivation drops by a staggering 34%.
A third of their drive just vanishes.
Exactly. Riker views this not just as bad pedagogical theory, but as targeted psychological warfare. The system systematically destroys a boy's spirit, teaches him he is inherently evil, and then turns around and blames him when he disengages, drops out, or fails to go to college.
And this messaging isn't just in the classroom. It completely saturates the media machine. Riker dissects how advertising and entertainment actively manufacture male shame. If you look at the famous 2013 Dove Real Beauty sketches, the one where the FBI sketch artist draws women based on their own descriptions versus strangers' descriptions, society lauded it as this beautiful, empowering moment. But Riker argues the entire emotional premise of that multi-million-dollar campaign relied implicitly on portraying men as emotionally blind, superficial, and incapable of perceiving genuine beauty or depth in their partners.
And it extends to comedy, which is often where the deepest cultural programming occurs because our defenses are down. Riker looks at the evolution of the television sitcom over the last 30 years. He notes how characters like Homer Simpson or Phil Dunphy from Modern Family or Peter Griffin serve to normalize profound male incompetence. Fathers are consistently portrayed as bumbling, emotionally stunted, oversized children who require constant maternal correction and eye-rolling from their hyper-competent wives.
But does a goofy sitcom dad really cause societal damage? A skeptic might say, come on, it's just a joke. We all know Phil Dunphy is a caricature.
That's a fair question, but Riker brings the receipts to show the damage is real. He points to a 2022 UCLA sociological study which tracked childhood media consumption. The studies show that children who are heavily exposed to this specific kind of male-negative, bumbling dad media are 40% more likely to view men as inherently disposable or unnecessary to family formation by the time they reach 10 years old. Riker's point to the listener is stark mumity. Your children are being systematically taught that you, the father, are a useless joke before they even hit puberty.
When you see how the culture, the courts, and the media systematically portray men as disposable, bumbling idiots, it completely changes how you view modern relationships. Which brings us to one of the most controversial and highly anticipated parts of Riker's book, The Dating Market. If you're a guy listening to this and you've ever felt like the modern digital dating scene is basically a rigged slot machine designed to drain your wallet and crush your self-esteem, Riker's breakdown is going to validate exactly what you've been experiencing.
Riker applies hard evolutionary psychology to modern dating apps to explain exactly why the system feels so broken for the average hardworking man. He cites a massive 2023 Stanford University study that analyzed millions of interactions to reveal the profound asymmetry in digital dating behavior. The data showed that men swipe right, indicating interest, 68% of the time. They are casting a wide, hopeful net. Women, however, swipe right only 14% of the time.
So men are saying yes to almost 7 out of 10 women, while women are saying yes to barely 1 out of 10 men. The bottleneck is incredible.
It is a mathematical bottleneck. And Rikers argues that the tech companies know this. Dating apps like Tinder and Bumble are not designed to find you a wife. They are algorithmic slot machines. They exist to extract money from desperate men through premium subscriptions like Tinder Gold or Bumble Premium. They sell men the illusion of access and connection, while their algorithms actually function to hypercharge and feed female hypergamy.
Explain hypergamy for the listener who might be hearing that term for the first time.
Hypergamy is the evolutionary biological drive, primarily observed in females across species, to mate up the dominance hierarchy, to seek a partner of higher social status, greater physical protection, and superior financial resources than herself.
And Riker backs up this hypergamy argument with leaked internal data from Tinder itself. This blew my mind. The data showed that women on the app swipe right on men whose profiles indicate they make over $200,000 a year at triple the rate they swipe on men making under $50,000. And here is the crazy part. They remain true even when independent judges rated the physical attractiveness of the rich men and the poorer men as completely identical. A physically average guy making $200K gets 3 times the attention of a handsome guy making $50K.
Riker insists this isn't female malice, it's deep-seated biology. He traces this back to the foundational work of evolutionary psychologist David Buss. In 1989, Buss conducted a famous, massive cross-cultural study of 10,000 people across 37 vastly different societies, from modern Western cities to rural agrarian tribes. The study definitively proved that across every single culture, regardless of religion or political system, women universally prioritize financial prospects, resource acquisition, and social status in a mate far more than men do. For 200,000 years of human evolution, a woman's physical survival and the survival of her offspring depended entirely on attaching herself to a competent resource provider.
So his argument is that modern feminism didn't actually change this hardwired biological reality. It just gave women the legal framework and the financial independence to ruthlessly act on that hypergamy without needing to provide long-term loyalty or commitment in return.
Exactly. And this biological reality leads directly into what Riker calls the beta male trap. He completely, utterly destroys the comforting societal narrative that the phrase nice guys finish last is just a toxic social myth. He calls it an immutable biological law.
Let's pause and dig into that, because boys are raised from kindergarten to be the nice guy. We are told to be gentle, to be polite, to accommodate others, to ask for consent before holding a hand.
Right, society actively conditions boys to be docile. But Riker argues that when these boys enter the mating market, they face a brutal reality check. Kindness, when it is not backed by underlying power or capacity for aggression, is viewed by female biology as submission, and submission is sexually invisible. To prove this, he cites a fascinating 2021 Harvard Business School study on physical posture and attraction. The researchers found that men who naturally adopt an expansive posture, taking up physical space, maintaining steady, unwavering eye contact, and speaking with a slow, deliberate cadence are rated over 3 times more attractive by female strangers than men who shrink their posture or speak quickly to please.
He also points to a 2020 University of Sussex study regarding vocal pitch. The researchers found that men with a naturally lower vocal pitch are consistently rated by women as more socially dominant, more competent, and significantly more sexually attractive. The data is clear. Status, dominance, the ability to handle stress without breaking, and the capacity for controlled aggression, these are the actual evolutionary markers women's nervous systems are attracted to, regardless of what they might claim they want on an Instagram post or a modern dating profile.
Which brings us to a critical juncture in Riker's thesis. Because if society is punishing male dominance culturally and legally, but female biology still demands it, what happens to the men? Riker argues that the modern world isn't just attacking men legally in the courts or culturally in the media, it is actively chemically attacking them on a physical level.
The statistics he polls regarding male physical decline are just terrifying. He notes that the U.S. Army is currently having to turn away 60% of all young male recruits because they literally cannot pass the most basic entry-level physical fitness tests. Simultaneously, there has been an unprecedented 300% spike in SSRI antidepressant prescriptions for young men since the year 2000.
Riker views this not as a public health crisis of depression, but as a systemic effort by the medical and educational establishment to medicate men into compliance. In his view, a man with optimal high testosterone is naturally competitive, confident, difficult to control, and inherently dangerous to a stagnant status quo. Therefore, the system seeks to numb him.
And brings in environmental factors to back this up too, right? It's not just the pills, it's in the environment.
Yes. He cites a highly disturbing 2020 Harvard medical study demonstrating the catastrophic effects of xenoestrogens, which are synthetic chemicals that mimic estrogen in our municipal water supplies, and BPA chemicals ubiquitous in modern plastics. The study showed that these environmental factors are lowering average male testosterone levels across the population by up to 1.3% every single year. Riker views this as unintended or perhaps somewhat tolerated chemical engineering that serves to soften and pacify the male population.
So how does a man fight back against invisible chemicals and societal medicating? Riker's answer is that physical fitness is no longer just about looking good at the beach. It is an act of political defiance. He states quite profoundly that a man who has the discipline to deadlift 400 pounds, who has mastered his own nervous system, cannot be easily guilt-tripped or intellectually bullied by a 22-year-old HR rep running a corporate DEI seminar. Physical strength breeds intellectual sovereignty.
But Riker stresses that solitary physical strength is ultimately a dead end. This is where he introduces the brotherhood imperative. He diagnoses the modern man as being deeply, dangerously, and historically isolated. Men today have zero tribal bonds. He compares this pathetic modern isolation to the historical success of extreme male tribalism. He looks at the ancient Spartan Sisya. These were mandatory, male-only mess halls where Spartan citizens ate every meal together, trained together, and bled together, creating an ironclad discipline and unbreakable loyalty that held off empires. He looks at the Mongol Empire, which conquered the largest contiguous landmass in human history, not just through brilliant cavalry tactics, but through intense male blood oaths and mutual survival pacts.
His point is clear. Men evolved to hunt and fight in a tribe. You strip the tribe away and stick a man in a cubicle, he withers and dies.
And he has clinical data to prove that this kind of male-only purposeful space is literally life-saving. Riker points to the men's sheds movement in Australia. This is a brilliant initiative. Over 1,200 physical community workshops scattered across the country where men can gather, free from female oversight or expectations, to do woodworking, welding, engine repair, and shoulder-to-shoulder projects. Research conducted by the University of Wollongong tracked the mental health outcomes of these men. The results were astounding. Participation in these men's sheds cut male suicide rates by a staggering 42%.
That is incredible. 42% just by letting men build birdhouses and fix lawnmowers together?
Because it acknowledges male psychology. Men heal, bond, and process trauma through shared action and mutual respect, not through forced face-to-face emotional vulnerability like traditional therapy demands. To recreate this survival dynamic in the modern world, Riker proposes what he calls the Iron Brotherhood framework. He says every man, if he wants to survive the current cultural climate, needs to actively recruit 3 specific roles into his inner circle. The mentor, an older, battle-tested man who has survived divorce or financial ruin and rebuilt himself. The soldier, an equal, a partner in the trenches who will hold you accountable to your goals. And the scout, someone sharp-eyed, highly technical, who brings intelligence and emerging trends from the outside world. Riker argues vehemently that without a vetted, loyal tribe, a man will inevitably be crushed by the centralized power of the state.
Which perfectly transitions us into the grand finale of the book, and honestly the reason this book is flying off the digital shelves. Riker doesn't just want you to be angry about the course, the culture, or the chemicals. He provides a highly technical, step-by-step blueprint for what he calls legal defection. If the game is prominently, structurally fixed against you, Riker says the only winning move is to walk off the plantation and build a parallel, untraceable society. And the level of detail he provides in this exit strategy section is absolutely mind-blowing.
It is essentially a manual for becoming a ghost in the machine. Let's start with his approach to basic bureaucratic privacy. He advises men to aggressively utilize the Privacy Act of 1974. This is an obscure but powerful federal law that explicitly prohibits government agencies and, by extension, many corporate entities from denying you a right or benefits simply for refusing to disclose your social security number unless specifically authorized by statute. Riker provides exact scripts for men to use to legally vanish from routine bureaucratic tracking, starving the data brokers that feed the system.
But the real meat of his exit strategy is the technology. He outlines something he calls the sovereign stack. Let's break this down, because it gets highly technical. If a man wants to communicate securely with his Iron Brotherhood, what does Riker suggest?
He advocates a total abandonment of standard platforms. No Apple iMessage, no Google Chat, no WhatsApp, because Facebook owns WhatsApp. Instead, he directs men to use Signal and, more importantly, Session.
Explain why Session is his gold standard.
Session is a decentralized messenger. Unlike Signal, which still requires you to register a phone number, which ties back to your real identity, Session requires no phone number at all. It assigns you an alphanumeric ID and routes all your messages through a decentralized onion routing network, similar to Tor. It is mathematically impossible for anyone, including the creators of Session, to know who you are talking to or what you are saying.
And what about data storage? If you have sensitive legal documents, crypto seed phrases, or business plans, you can't put those on Google Drive.
Exactly, because Google will comply with a family court subpoena in an instant. Riker recommends IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, and Filecoin. These are entirely decentralized storage networks. Think of the normal internet like a giant filing cabinet owned by Amazon or Google. They can open your drawer anytime. IPFS shreds your file into 1,000 encrypted pieces and scatters them across thousands of independent computers globally. It cannot be subpoenaed, censored, or shut down by a central authority because there is no central authority.
He even goes as far as the operating system on your laptop.
Yes, he discusses utilizing privacy-focused Linux distributions, specifically mentioning a hardened build called Liberty OS. These systems are designed from the ground up to block telemetry, identifying trackers, and corporate surveillance at the root kernel level.
And then we get to the money. Because if they can't track your text, they will track your bank account. Riker tells men to abandon the traditional banking system entirely. But he also warns against using standard public ledger crypto like Bitcoin, right?
Correct. A lot of people mistakenly think Bitcoin is anonymous. It is actually highly public. Anyone can trace a transaction on the blockchain. If a family court forensic accountant ties your identity to a Bitcoin wallet, they can see every penny you have. Instead, Riker advocates for the exclusive use of privacy coins, specifically Monero and Zcash. Monero uses ring signatures and stealth addresses to completely obfuscate the sender, the receiver, and the amount sent. It leaves absolutely zero trace. To the state, the wealth simply ceases to exist.
And for the men who have already amassed significant wealth, the Daniel Reeves of the world Riker advocates for geographic arbitrage. Why stick around and fight a rigged, gynocentric family court system in the West when you can simply pack up your laptop and leave? He notes an incredible statistic. In 2023, roughly 17,000 Americans officially relocated to Dubai. Riker claims many of these are high net worth men specifically fleeing Western family courts because the jurisdiction in Dubai fundamentally respects fathers' rights, does not recognize Western feminist legal theory, and absolutely does not enforce ruinous, lifelong alimony judgments.
For those who can't move to Dubai, he details domestic asset protection. He explains how men are utilizing complex offshore asset protection trusts in jurisdictions like the Cook Islands or Anguilla. If an angry ex-wife and her lawyer win a massive judgment in a California court, an offshore trustee in Anguilla will literally ignore the U.S. court order because U.S. judgments hold absolutely zero legal jurisdiction there.
He also introduces a concept for collective wealth protection that blew my mind. The crypto citadel. Explain how this multi-sig wallet works.
This is a brilliant application of technology to solve a legal vulnerability. A multi-sig or multi-signature cryptocurrency wallet requires multiple people to approve a transaction before funds can move. Riker suggests a man sets up a wallet with his trusted Iron Brotherhood, say, 3 men total. The wallet is programmed so that at least 2 of the 3 men must input their cryptographic keys to move any money. If a family court judge orders a man to liquidate his crypto assets to pay a massive divorce settlement, the man can legally and truthfully tell the judge, "I cannot access those funds alone." The other 2 men refuse to sign the transaction. Because the funds are mathematically and cryptographically locked, the state is entirely powerless to seize them. It completely neutralizes the court's leverage.
It is mathematically shielded from the state. That is wild. And finally, to avoid the court's jurisdiction entirely, he discusses the rise of male co-living spaces, massive off-grid homesteads, and intentional communities that enforce a strict, unbreakable no-kids clause. Riker argues that because the state uses children as the primary emotional and legal leverage point to extract wealth from men via child support and custody battles, the ultimate ironclad defense for men who wish to remain truly sovereign is to completely avoid triggering family court jurisdiction by opting out of reproduction within the current legal framework entirely.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. The density of this book is incredible. As we synthesize what we've learned, the macro view of Off The Plantation is undeniably clear. Conrad Riker is not asking men to violently revolt in the streets. He is not asking them to harbor hatred or seek petty revenge against women. He is providing a highly tactical, emotionally detached, meticulously researched manual for legal defection. He operates on the foundational premise that the legal, economic, and cultural gain is permanently, irrevocably fixed against men. Therefore, the only logical, rational response for a man who values his life and labor is absolute self-sovereignty.
Exactly. And look, whether you agree with Riker's interpretation of evolutionary psychology, whether you buy into his historical reading of the Frankfurt School, or whether you think his views on the family court system are extreme, it is absolutely impossible to deny the sheer volume of data, case law, and historical analysis he has synthesized in this book. From exposing the 1969 no-fault divorce laws to breaking down the algorithmic exploitation of modern dating apps, he presents a deeply controversial but highly structured, internally consistent worldview. And as we've discussed today, this isn't just internet theory. This is a worldview that is actively, right now, reshaping how thousands of men are operating in society. They are buying the privacy tech, they are restructuring their tax strategies, they are moving offshore, and they are forming these closed, tight-knit brotherhoods.
It really forces you to pause and consider the massive long-term macroeconomic consequences of this movement, getting mainstream traction among high-earning men.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week. If Riker's vision of a parallel, decentralized, completely untraceable society of sovereign men continues to grow, powered by invisible Monero transactions, encrypted networks like Session, untouchable offshore trusts, and self-sustaining off-grid homesteads, What happens to the traditional economy and the bloated tax base when its primary producers, the men who build the roads, write the code, and fund the system, completely vanish from the ledger?
It's a profound, terrifying question for the establishment. If the highest earning, hardest working men systematically withdraw their capital, their labor, and their participation from the taxable grid, the institutions that rely exclusively on that extraction will face an existential, unrecoverable crisis.
It is a fascinating and sobering scenario to imagine. Listen, if this deep dive sparked your curiosity, if it challenged your perspective on how the world works, or if you just want to verify all this incredible data and read the legal statutes for yourself, you absolutely need to read the source material. Go to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy the ebook, Walk Off the Plantation, Escape Feminist Economics as a Man. And make sure to follow the author, at Conrad Riker, at his Substack to keep up with his latest writings, research, and technical guides. Finally, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our show so you never miss another deep dive. We rely entirely on your support to keep dissecting these massive controversial topics. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.